Right now, on opposite sides of two different oceans, meteorologists are watching two separate tropical systems that could both organize into depressions within the same handful of days. One is sitting roughly 100 miles southeast of the Hawaiian Islands, nearly stationary, but forecast to have a 90% chance of developing into a tropical depression by midweek. The other is a combination of two disturbances, one already over the open Atlantic, one still sitting over Africa, expected to merge into a single system and track toward the Caribbean. Neither one is a hurricane yet. Neither one is even a named storm yet. But both are being watched closely enough that the National Hurricane Center and the Central Pacific Hurricane Center have both issued formal development odds. And that's exactly the kind of moment where a story either gets told accurately or gets turned into a panic headline with a spinning satellite graphic and zero actual context. We're going to do the accurate version. Today, we're breaking down exactly what's developing in the Atlantic and the Central Pacific right now, why forecasters are treating these two systems so differently despite both carrying real development potential, what the actual numbers behind those percentages mean, and what history tells us about how systems like this typically play out. No exaggeration, no invented urgency, just what the meteorology actually says as of this week. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments, do you actually track storm development percentages yourself during hurricane season, or do you only start paying attention once something gets a name? I ask because I think there's a real gap between how forecasters communicate risk and careful, evolving probabilities, and how most of us actually consume it, which is usually just waiting for the moment a system becomes real enough to worry about. And if you want to stay ahead of every development in both basins as it happens, subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps us keep making this kind of content. A thumbs up goes a long way too. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches more people who want the real forecast instead of the scary headline. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with the system that currently carries the highest development probability of the two, because it's also the one with the most immediate relevance if you live in or have travel plans to the islands. As of this week, the Central Pacific Hurricane Center is tracking an area of low pressure designated CP93, located roughly 100 miles east-southeast of the Hawaiian Islands. Right now, it's described as a broad, disorganized area of showers and thunderstorms, and it's essentially stationary, not really moving in any direction yet. But forecasters have flagged the environmental conditions around it as conducive for development, and the official outlook gives it a 50% chance of organizing into a tropical depression within 48 hours and a 90% chance within 7 days. That 90% number is worth sitting with for a second, because in tropical forecasting, that's about as close to a sure thing as meteorologists are willing to commit to this far in advance. When you see a 7-day formation probability that high, it generally means the ingredients, warm ocean water, low wind shear, a well-defined area of low, pressure to organize around, are already lining up in a way that leaves forecasters with real confidence, even if the exact track and strength remain genuinely uncertain. Here's what happens next, mechanically speaking. As the system develops, current forecasts show it beginning to track west, northwest, or northwest, which would carry it in the general direction of the islands over the following days. This is the same basic setup we talked about a few weeks ago when we covered why Hawaii sits in a genuinely more active Central Pacific season than usual this year, driven by a strengthening El Niño pattern that's suppressing storm development in the Atlantic while doing the opposite in the Central and Eastern Pacific, warming the water and lowering wind shear in exactly the region this system now sits in. It's important to be precise about what we actually know at this stage, because this is exactly the point in a storm's life cycle where speculation tends to run ahead of the data. We know the system exists. We know the odds of it becoming at least a tropical depression this week are high. We do not yet know its eventual strength, whether it will organize into a tropical storm, a hurricane, or something in between. We do not yet know its precise track, since the system currently sitting more than 1,000 miles from land has an enormous amount of open ocean and an enormous number of possible steering scenarios between now and any potential approach to the islands. Anyone showing you a confident 5-day forecast track for a system that hasn't even become a depression yet is skipping past a level of uncertainty that real forecasters are being careful to communicate honestly. On the other side of the country, and the other side of an entire ocean, the National Hurricane Center is watching a genuinely different kind of setup, one that's a little more complex because it actually involves two separate disturbances that forecasters expect to combine into a single system. The first piece is a tropical wave already out over the open Atlantic. The second is still sitting back over Africa, not yet even off the coast. According to the latest analysis, the Atlantic-based disturbance is expected to absorb the moisture from the African system as that second wave moves off the continent. and forecasters believe this combined system has a reasonable chance of organizing, provided it can fight off interference from nearby Saharan dust, a factor that suppresses tropical development by drying out the atmosphere and choking off the moisture a storm needs to organize. As of the most recent outlook, this system carries a medium chance of development, and the consensus of computer forecast models currently points toward it tracking in the general direction of the Caribbean over the coming week. There's also a third area being watched further west, a separate disturbance with less available moisture, currently forecast to track more directly westward into an area of hostile upper-level winds, the kind of wind shear that tends to tear apart developing storms before they can organize. Current thinking suggests this one is more likely to arrive in the southeastern Caribbean, simply as a surge of tropical moisture, rather than as an organized system, though forecasters are keeping it on the watch list since that assessment could change. This is a genuinely useful moment to understand something about how the Atlantic hurricane season has been behaving overall this year. Multiple forecasting groups, including Colorado State University's widely respected seasonal outlook team, have been tracking a below-average Atlantic season overall in 2026, driven by that same strengthening El Niño pattern that's boosting activity in the Pacific while suppressing it in the Atlantic. With only a couple of named storms logged so far this season, well behind a typical pace, there's been a sense among forecasters that a sudden uptick was likely as the season approached its historical peak, which typically falls between mid-August and mid-October. What we're watching this week may be exactly that expected uptick, beginning to materialize right on the seasonal schedule forecasters predicted months ago. If you're comparing the coverage of these two systems, you'll notice something important. The Central Pacific system near Hawaii is being discussed with a real sense of near-term specificity, a 90% 7-day. Formation chance is about as concrete as tropical forecasting gets. The Atlantic system, despite involving two separate disturbances merging together, is being discussed in more conditional terms, medium chance, provided it survives Saharan dust interference, general direction of the Caribbean, rather than a specific target. This difference isn't inconsistency. It reflects two genuinely different sets of atmospheric conditions. The Central Pacific system is developing in an environment that this year's climate pattern has made unusually favorable for tropical development, warm water, low shear, few competing factors working against it. The Atlantic system, by contrast, is developing during what's shaping up as a suppressed season overall, working against the exact kind of interference, dry Saharan air, and disruptive upper-level wind patterns that El Niño tends to reinforce across the Atlantic basin specifically. Same basic phenomenon, a tropical disturbance trying to organize, but two very different atmospheric environments to organize within. This is actually a good real-world illustration of something we've talked about before when we covered the science behind El Niño and La Niña. These climate patterns don't just nudge the odds slightly in one basin or another, they can produce genuinely opposite outcomes in different ocean basins during the exact same week, which is precisely what's playing out in front of us right now. A quieter than usual Atlantic system fighting for survival against dry air. At the same moment, a Central Pacific system sits in close to ideal conditions with a 90% shot at development. Since both of these systems are being described with specific percentages, it's worth taking a moment to explain what those numbers actually represent, because this is one of the most consistently misunderstood parts of tropical forecasting, and understanding it changes how you should read every storm update you see this season. When the National Hurricane Center, or Central Pacific Hurricane Center, assigns a formation probability, they're providing a genuine statistical estimate based on current atmospheric conditions, computer model consensus, and historical patterns for similar setups, not a guess dressed up as a number. These percentages get calculated for two standard windows, 48 hours and 7 days, and they get updated multiple times a day as new satellite imagery, model runs, and reconnaissance data come in. A system sitting at a medium, 40 to 50% chance, the way the Atlantic system currently is, means real, meaningful uncertainty still exists. It's genuinely close to a coin flip on whether that system organizes into a depression at all. A system at 90%, like the Hawaii area disturbance, reflects forecasters seeing conditions that history shows almost always result in organization, while still leaving room for the reality that a small percentage of even highly favorable setups fail to come together. This matters because a lot of viral storm coverage treats any system under NHC watch as functionally equivalent, as if being on the map at all means a named storm is inevitable. It isn't. The overwhelming majority of tropical disturbances that get flagged for monitoring during any given hurricane season never organize into anything that gets a name, and a large share of the ones that do never approach land at all. Development probability is exactly the tool forecasters use to communicate that range of outcomes honestly, rather than either dismissing a system that deserves attention or overstating one that's still a long way from becoming a real threat. It's worth walking through the actual stages a system like this passes through, because both of the disturbances we're covering today sit at the very earliest point of that process, and understanding the ladder ahead of them helps put the current uncertainty in perspective. A tropical wave or area of low pressure, the stage both of today's systems are currently in, is essentially disorganized. Showers and thunderstorms exist in the area, but they lack a well-defined center of rotation. If conditions are favorable, warm ocean water generally needs to be at least around 80 degrees Fahrenheit through a sufficient depth, low wind shear, and enough atmospheric moisture that disorganized activity can begin consolidating around a center, at which point it becomes a tropical depression defined by sustained winds of up to 38 miles per hour and a closed, organized circulation. From there, if winds increase past 39 miles per hour, it earns a name and becomes a tropical storm. Hurricane status in both the Atlantic and Central Pacific comes at sustained winds of 74 miles per hour or higher. Both of today's systems are sitting at the very first rung of that ladder. The Hawaii area system has a genuinely high chance of climbing to the second rung, tropical depression status, within days. Whether it climbs any further than that, and what track it takes if it does, remains a separate and much less certain question, one that will become clearer with each passing day as more data comes in and computer models converge on a more confident answer. Since we're covering two different basins in the same story, it's worth grounding both in the historical reality of what these regions actually experience during a typical August, because context is exactly what turns a scary-sounding update into a genuinely useful one. In the Central Pacific, this is close to peak season, which historically runs heaviest in August and September, driven by the year's warmest sea surface temperatures. A typical Central Pacific season sees around 4 to 5 named storms. This year, government forecasters have projected as many as 13, tied directly to the same El Nino pattern currently steering CP93 toward development. Direct hurricane landfalls on the Hawaiian Islands remain historically rare, largely because storms approaching from the south and east tend to weaken as they encounter cooler water and stronger wind shear closer to the islands. But as we've covered before with Hurricane Lane in 2018 and the wildfire disaster tied to Hurricane Dora's passage in 2023, a storm doesn't need to make direct landfall to produce serious, even catastrophic impacts on the islands through rainfall, flooding, or fire risk from its outer wind field. In the Atlantic, we're approaching the portion of the season, mid-August through mid-October, that historically produces the vast majority of the year's significant activity. This year's slower start, tied to the same suppressive El Nino pattern, has been consistent with forecaster expectations all along, and the appearance of multiple disturbances now, right as the season approaches its climatological peak, is arguably the season finally catching up to schedule rather than any kind of unusual development. For context on what's actually at stake if any of these systems do organize and threaten the U.S. coastline, seasonal landfall probability models from groups like Colorado State University have placed the chance of at least a named storm affecting Louisiana's coastline this year at just over 50%, with the odds of that becoming a major hurricane sitting closer to 10%, numbers that reflect a genuinely below average but far from zero risk season along the Gulf Coast. If you've been watching tropical weather coverage across multiple outlets this week, you've probably seen language like 5 threats brewing or graphics showing an entire ocean basin covered in colored blobs, and it's worth being direct about what that actually represents. As of this week, the National Hurricane Center and Central Pacific Hurricane Center combined are watching a handful of separate disturbance areas stretching from the coast of Africa to the waters east of Hawaii. That sounds and looks dramatic on a map, but it's also almost exactly what meteorologists expect to see during the specific week of the year we're currently in, the approach to the historical peak of hurricane season in both basins simultaneously. Multiple simultaneous areas of interest being tracked at once isn't a sign that something unusual is happening to global weather patterns. It's a sign that the calendar has arrived at the part of the year when tropical development is supposed to ramp up in both oceans, roughly on schedule with what seasonal outlooks predicted months in advance. The genuinely useful information here isn't the raw count of systems on the map, it's the specific development odds, tracks, and timelines attached to each one individually, which is exactly why we've spent this much time walking through the Hawaii system and the Atlantic system separately, rather than lumping them together into one vague watch-out headline. If you're in Hawaii or have travel plans there in the coming week, the practical guidance is straightforward and doesn't require panic. Keep an eye on official Central Pacific Hurricane Center updates rather than viral graphics, since this system's odds and projected track will sharpen considerably over the next 48 to 72 hours, as it either organizes or doesn't. If it does develop and begins tracking toward the islands, remember what we've covered before. Rainfall and flooding risk from a system like this can matter just as much as wind, even if the storm's center ultimately stays offshore. Have a basic emergency kit ready now, rather than during a last-minute scramble, since this is historically the peak window for Central Pacific activity, regardless of how this specific system plays out. If you're anywhere along the Gulf Coast or southeastern U.S. coastline, the Atlantic situation is still developing enough that specific local guidance would be premature, but the broader seasonal reality is worth taking seriously. A below-average season forecast doesn't mean a zero-risk season, and the systems we're watching this week represent exactly the kind of mid-August uptick forecasters have been expecting since their preseason outlooks were first published. This is a good moment, not a panic moment, but a genuinely good moment to check your hurricane kit, confirm your evacuation zone if you're in a coastal area, and make sure your family communication plan is current, precisely because we're heading into the statistically busiest stretch of the season with real disturbances already on the board. Here's what's worth taking away from this one. 2 tropical systems on opposite sides of 2 oceans are being watched by meteorologists this week, and they represent 2 genuinely different stories rather than one uniform storm season is exploding narrative. The Central Pacific system near Hawaii sits in an unusually favorable environment this year, part of a Central Pacific season that forecasters correctly predicted would run well above average months ago, and it carries a real high probability of organizing into a depression within days. The Atlantic system is trying to develop in a much more suppressed environment, fighting Saharan dust and a strengthening El Niño pattern working against it, arriving right as the Atlantic season finally reaches the stretch of the calendar where activity is expected to increase regardless. Neither of these is a confirmed hurricane, neither has a name yet. Both deserve genuine attention, and both deserve to be tracked through official sources as they evolve, rather than through screenshots and percentage numbers that go stale within hours. That's the difference between responsible storm coverage and manufactured panic, not pretending nothing is happening, but giving you the actual, current, evolving picture so you can make real decisions instead of reacting to a scary headline that's already out of date by the time you see it. We'll be tracking both of these systems closely over the coming days, along with anything new that develops in either basin as we move deeper into the peak of hurricane season. Subscribe so you don't miss any updates, and drop a comment letting me know which system you're watching more closely, the one near Hawaii or the one in the Atlantic, and why. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches people who want the real forecast instead of another panic headline. Stay prepared, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.